Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Kalamata, Greece on May 1st, 2026. We're very pleased to be joined again by our good friend and frequent guest, John Helmer. John is the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia and the only Western journalist to direct his own bureau, independent of national or commercial ties. His latest book, one of numerous books that are eminently worth reading, is Long Live Novichok, the British Poison Which Fooled the World. Thank you for joining us again today, John.
Thanks for having me, Dimitri, and I wish you and our audience a very good, hopeful celebration of Mayday today.
And that is indeed where I wanted to start briefly, John, before we get into more meaty matters, at least in terms of current events. Today is known in Europe as Mayday, in other parts of the world, of course. And in 1889, May 1st was designated Mayday, a day of support for workers, by an international federation of socialist groups and trade unions. And first of all, to working peoples everywhere, as my comrade John just said, we express Reason to Resist our best wishes and solidarity on this May Day 2026. But John, you had a few words to say on your website today about May Day, and you talked about the relative importance of this day in Russia and the United States and the relationship of this day to U.S. history. Could you just take a couple of minutes and perhaps elaborate on it?
Just a couple of minutes. I'm not a native or never been a resident of Chicago, visited Chicago a little bit. But Chicago was the origin of the union protests in the 1880s for lower working hours, better working conditions, improved pay. And so May Day was a Chicago origin, was the Chicago origin, and it's honored that way and remembered still that way in Russia, although the United States has obviously done everything possible to suppress the workers' history, the socialist history of the May Day holiday, celebrated really almost right around the world, but not in the United States where it originated. And that's all I had to say in today's mention, except for mentioning Clarence Darrow, a special American hero of mine. I've had this sort of avocation of having to fight lots of fights in the courts of different countries, including Russia. And Clarence Darrow was, without a doubt, I've read his courtroom speeches, I've studied his life. This was a man who was the most extraordinary lawyer in U.S. history, a courtroom litigator. He played all sides, as lawyers are often obliged to do. He represented the Chicago Railways. He also represented Chicago unions. He represented individuals who accused of bombing targets in protests, in labor protests in California. He had a very long career, but as a lawyer, this man could speak in court for 12 hours straight. And when you read his speeches now, it's almost 100 years since he gave some of these speeches. They're an extraordinary display of concentration, of sympathy, of learning, the likes of which has simply disappeared from the American legal profession to everybody's loss. So for me, it's a celebration of a day of hopefulness and solidarity, and that's the way it is in Russia. I can see a lot of the military bloggers, the sort of avant-garde or the advanced guard of the Russian free press, who are displaying the red flag today, the hammer and sickle today, speaking of best wishes to their comrades. These are not members of the Communist Party. These are not voters necessarily for Gennady Zyuganov, the leader of the Russian Communist Party. No, they're expressing solidarity with a very important feature of Russian history. And as you said, ironically, that history begins in Chicago in between 1886 and 1889.
Right. All I have to add to that fine explanation is that in Canada, where I spend most of my time, there too, the federal and provincial governments seem totally uninterested in recognizing the historical importance of this day for workers around the world. Now, with that, John, I'd like to turn to the events that have transpired since the most important events, at least as I see it, that have transpired since you and I last spoke last week. And before I ask you about the first of those, the foreign minister of Iran visiting Moscow, I just want to remind our readers or subscribers, if you are subscribers, please like and share this. And if you're not a subscriber, please become one and help us expand the reach of our unapologetic resistance journalism. So with that, the foreign minister of Iran, Abbas Araghchi, went to Moscow, I believe it was on Monday, John. And
Yes.
Although he himself is not the head of the Iranian state, he met with President Putin and, of course, with the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, amongst others. And I'd like to begin by showing an excerpt of that meeting.
Мужественно и героически борется народ Ирана за свою независимость, за свой суверенитет. И, конечно, очень надеемся на то, что, опираясь вот на это мужество и стремление к независимости, иранский народ пройдет под руководством нового лидера сложный период испытаний и наступит мир.
فرموده دنیا الان متوجه شد که قدرت واقعی ایران رو در مقابله با ارتش آمریکا و ملاحظه کردن و روشن شد که جمهوری اسلامی ایران یک نظام با ثبات مستحکم و با قدرت زیاد با اتکای به مردم خودش است.
Now, John, many commentators, particularly in the corporate media, interpreted what happened in that meeting, and particularly those remarks, as a ringing endorsement by the Russian president of the cause of Iran, and a clear siding by the Russian government with Iran in this war of aggression. As I understand your position, I've read your articles about this that you've written in the last several days. You have a rather different take on President Putin's approach to this war. Could you take a moment and, if I'm correct in my understanding, explain how you part company with the sort of mainstream narrative about what really happened in that meeting?
If we go back to your clip, and I don't suggest we run it again, the important figure at that meeting was on the far right of the Russian side of the table, and that was Admiral Igor Kostyakov. Admiral Kostyakov is the chief of the senior Russian intelligence agency, now the GRU, the military intelligence agency. And his presence there is a very important indicator of the nature of the conversation that was not made public. Second, President Putin's voice, you could hear him speak, was hesitant, and he was reading from notes. Third, the Iranian side was not represented by an intelligence officer nor a military officer. There was Abbas Araghchi, as you've said, in the center. On his right, there was a deputy foreign minister. I'm sorry, I can't recall his name exactly. And he's in charge of nuclear negotiations and international relations at the Iranian Foreign Ministry. And then on Araghchi's left, there was Ambassador, I've suddenly forgotten his name, Kalali, I'm very sorry, Kazem Kalali, I believe is the name of the ambassador, who's done a considerable job of briefing the Russian government and conveying messages between Tehran and Moscow. No military officer, no intelligence officer, but the Russian side had the senior intelligence officer, the senior military officer representing the general staff. That indicates to me that a number of things. First of all, the Russian side will have presented through Kostyakov its assessment of U.S. capacities, the U.S. deployment buildup, and what the Russian side understands from its entire intelligence gathering operations to be US intentions for Iran. That's very important. Second, Kostyakov is there to discuss what Russia's capable of doing to assist in deterring and defending Iran. And Arakchi is there, along with the ambassador, to indicate what Iran needs. Now, Putin, in a later section of the speech that's on record in the Kremlin communique, speaks of Russia being ready to provide all that meets Iran's interests, all that meets Iran's interests, and then he balanced that with also the interests of everyone else in the Persian Gulf. Now, that's an expression from Putin of support for what's necessary to enable Iran to defend its sovereignty, defend its independence. Those were the key words that Putin read out. Okay, that's Monday. And clearly, the secret side of the meeting, which Kostyakov will have led, remains secret, and there's no speculation in the Russian press, nor should there be. Come Thursday, if I've got my days right, between Wednesday and Thursday, President Putin initiated a telephone call to Washington. He called Trump, and they had a 90-minute conversation. And I've gone to, in the most recent reports, gone through exactly what the readout was as published by Yuri Ushakov, the president's foreign affairs advisor and spokesman. He was on the very far side to the left of your screen in the meeting with Arakchi on Monday. Why did Putin call Trump? That's a question that's not going to be answered in Moscow, and it's only partly answered from the readout. I don't want to overstretch everybody's patience, but let me make a couple of points here. The readout from Ushakov of this telephone call was then almost immediately paralleled by statements from Trump, who was speaking at the Oval Office in Washington, more or less at the same time, when asked to describe what the conversation had been about. It's very important to understand then what Putin told Trump about the Iran war. And all that can be found, all that I can find in the readout, bearing in mind a readout isn't exactly a summary of exactly what was said, but a summary of what the Russian side wants to be understood as having been said and discussed. And bear in mind, Putin called Trump. It wasn't a Trump initiative. It was a Russian initiative, which immediately raises the question, why call Trump now? With respect to Iran, what the readout says, and I'll read it out, the quote from the Ushakov's readout, so that we can understand it more clearly and so you can cross-examine it. Russia, quotes, remains firmly committed to facilitating diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a peaceful resolution of this crisis, and has put forward several proposals to help address differences over the Iranian nuclear program. To this end, active contacts with the Iranian representatives, leaders of the Gulf countries, as well as with Israel, and naturally the negotiating team of the United States will continue. That's Putin saying he's addressing the nuclear issues. However, Arakchi on Monday told the Russian side, as the Iranian side, through Mr. Galibaf, the Speaker of Parliament, have told the world that Iran is now committed to a three-stage negotiation, and you know this very well, Dimitri, in which nuclear issues are third stage. They must come later, according to the Iranian proposals, because the United States is demonstrably unreliable to negotiate with, makes undertakings that are worthless when voiced, worthless when spoken. So the primary first stage for Iran is to negotiate secure guarantees that a ceasefire will lead to a permanent cessation of war, not a preparation for a next round. That's the first stage in the Iranian negotiating plan. Putin didn't mention a word on that. Second stage for the Iranian side is to develop with the United States and with the Gulf countries a new regime for the Hormuz. And we've talked about on this program, I don't want to bore everybody with the details. However, the new regime for the Hormuz obliges the United States to end its blockade, number one. Putin did not mention that. Number two, it obliges the world and the Gulf countries to accept that there will be a regime which will pay a toll, and that will go to be shared between the two littoral countries, that's shore countries, Oman on one side of the Gulf of the Hormuz and Iran on the other. And I've calculated approximately $20 billion worth of revenue as a serious year-long reparation for the damage done to Iran. That second stage, call it just the Hormuz regime stage. No mention by President Putin of that. Third stage would be nuclear issues. Why then did President Putin fail to tell Trump that the crucial stepwise procedure for negotiation doesn't start with nuclear issues? It does not start with a Russian proposal to take the advanced, highly enriched uranium stocks of Iran and store them under Russian guard. That's not an acceptable proposal to the United States. It's not acceptable at all to the United States. So what exactly Russia is offering to Trump on nuclear issues is not only in dispute factually, but in dispute as a matter of negotiating priority. So what else did Putin have to say to Trump with respect to American threats to continue the war? That's the first stage in the Iranian program. I'll read it out, what he said. The president of Russia pointed out that if the United States and Israel resume military action, this would inevitably lead to extremely adverse consequences, not only for Iran and its neighbors, but for the entire international community. Putin stressed, that a ground operation on Iranian territory would be particularly unacceptable and dangerous. Now, that's the only specific language that President Putin delivered to President Trump with the intention of delivering it also to Iran and the rest of the world, that Russia opposes any attempt by the United States plus Israel and the Emiratis and Saudis to invade and occupy Iranian territory. Now, whether you consider it a particularly strong warning or not, that's all he said. Does it sound to you, Dimitri, or to our audience, as a particularly solid-sounding Russian deterrent for the United States to make such an attempt? I don't think it sounds like a deterrent to me. Does it sound like a deterrent to you?
Well, this raises a larger question, John, which is the utility of readouts. I would, point out that they spoke for an hour and a half. So yes. It is absolutely unavoidably true that there was a lot of stuff said in that conversation that does not appear in the readout, because the readout could, all that is said in the readout could have been expressed between the two men, both what was said in the readout about President Putin's comments and what was said in the readout about President Trump's comments in less than 5 minutes. So you know, like you, John, I study readouts carefully, and that I'm not suggesting for one moment that my judgment about these things is infallible. I'm sure it's not, but I, on a daily basis, for example, look at readouts issued by the Prime Minister of Canada every day. And I find that these documents are of limited utility. Sometimes they reveal useful information. Sometimes they're completely devoid of any meaningful information. Sometimes it's a bit of both. There are bits of information in there, but you know that much has been left out. So I personally don't attach too much weight to the fact that, for example, President Putin's readout, or the readout of the conversation, didn't expressly say that President Putin supports Iran's proposal for the sequencing of the negotiating issues. In other words, for example, delaying the whole nuclear issue until preliminary issues have been discussed. I also would say that President Putin has to walk a very fine line here because he has relations, his country has important relations with other countries in the region. So Russia, for example, is a member of OPEC Plus, and I'm sure that it's a member of OPEC Plus because it deems it to be in the national interest to be a member of OPEC Plus. And, you know, enraging the autocracies of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Bahrain and so forth, the other members of OPEC Plus, is not necessarily in Russian interests. So in any case, that's my view of all of this. And we can debate this if you like, but I just wanted to put forward another alternative perspective on these readouts. The other thing I want to ask you here, John, and if you want to respond to what I've said, by all means, please do that. But I wanted to ask you about something you said in one of your articles this week about the posture of the Russian government. And I understood you to express the view that President Putin's attitude towards this conflict is not necessarily the same as the attitude of the powerful Russian Security Council to this conflict. Could you elaborate on your views in that regard? Do you believe there to be a material division between President Putin and the Security Council? And if so, what do you believe the nature of that division to be?
I believe the evidence indicates that, but let me just go back a couple of little points. If President Trump and President Putin talk for a total of 90 minutes, you have to subtract roughly 1/3 of that time for translation. So it's not a 90-minute conversation, it's less than 60 minutes, less than 60 minutes. And the readout indicates that President Putin began with expressions of solidarity for Trump following the Saturday night Washington affair, and birthday greetings to Melania Trump, who's congratulated by President Putin for her support for reunification of Ukrainian and Russian children. That's I won't get into that, but for its hollow propaganda value. But more to the point of how to read a readout. The readout is intended to be for the general audience, but specifically for Iran and all the other Russian allies, including China. Remember, President Trump will visit China in 2 weeks' time, unless the Chinese cancel it, and that seems unlikely now. So 14th, 15th of May, Trump will be in China. So this readout's intended for everybody else, not for people who don't understand exactly what's going on. So I think we're talking about a 45 to 50-minute conversation, and I think this is a fair summary of what the Russian priorities are in dealing with the United States, that the Kremlin wants to be understood as President Putin's priorities, not Admiral Kostyukov's, not the general staff, not the intelligence services or the foreign ministry, who are closer to the, let's call it the consensus of the Security Council. Let me come to your Security Council division with President Putin in a minute, but I want to read out something that's in the readout that's unmistakably relevant in answer to your question. As we head towards the end of the readout, I'll quote, "When discussing Russian-US relations, both leaders pointed to the great potential for mutually beneficial cooperation in the economic and energy spheres. The president stated that their representatives are already engaged in substantive discussions on a number of large-scale economic projects. Now, let me explain exactly what that means. That's Putin endorsing Kirill Dmitriev, his special representative for negotiations with Trump's family, who's been at work since for 2 years now, negotiating with Stephen Witkoff, Jared Kushner, Scott Bessent, and others, in the Russian belief that the Trump administration can be bribed and otherwise economically induced to with major promises of big economic and financial deal making in Russia. That's their theory, okay? And when the readout says the president stated their representatives are already engaged in substantive discussions, the representatives there are Dmitriev, Witkoff, and Kushner. Dmitriev represents the Russian oligarchs. He represents President Putin personally. He's one source describes him to me as Putin's whisperer. He represents a particular domestic economic line. He represents a particular assessment of the United States, which is not shared in the Security Council. It's in fact repudiated publicly by former President Medvedev, and almost certainly repudiated, but less openly, by Foreign Minister Lavrov, who tried to lock Dmitriev out of the first round of negotiations in Riyadh with the Trump administration. There's no goodwill there, and there's profound policy disagreement. So when that goes in to the readout, it means Putin is expressing and endorsing Dmitriev's ongoing negotiations with Witkoff and Kushner, notwithstanding that those two are unacceptable negotiating parties on all Middle Eastern fronts, whether it's Gaza, Palestine, Lebanon, or Iran. Dmitriev himself advertises in a stream of tweets each day his readiness to do business with the Trump family, with Trump himself. He has ignored the wars, ignored them totally. He bangs a constant drum on against the British, the Germans, the French, blaming them, as it were, for Russia's for their own energy problems and for lobbying for Ukraine with the Trump administration. He's got a particularly twisted, incorrect, inaccurate analysis of Europe's role and of the Trump role, but he has a particular role to play, which Putin endorsed here. Now, when that happens, that I think we can say, in answer to your question, that surfaces a very serious division of what the utility is, as the Security Council sees it, as Admiral Kostyakov sees it, as Foreign Minister Lavrov sees it, of negotiating on that basis through Dmitriev with those two, Witkoff and Kushner. In other words, they think the utility is zero or minus. Putin does not, the president of Russia does not agree. And in the readout, we have President Putin initiating a telephone call with Trump to endorse that process. Now, exactly what has that process achieved to date that's in the Russian state interest, as distinct from the private business interest that Dmitriev represents? Zero. Dmitriev was sent in April. Now he's met with Witkoff and Kushner, to my knowledge, December, January, February, March, and April. The April, that's once every month. That's quite active. Also, Yuri Ushakov, the president's assistant, has been taped, and those tapes have appeared in Bloomberg, more or less authentic, harmless, but they show that Ushakov and Witkoff are on Steve and Yuri basis. So when Putin refers to their representatives engaged in substantive discussions, he means Ushakov, Dmitriev, Vitkov, and Kushner. No involvement on a military level, no involvement intelligence level, no involvement in the foreign ministry. That's a separate channel. And the utility of that channel was tested at the beginning of April when Dmitriev went to the US to attempt to get an extension of the waiver of Russian sanctions, the sanction against India, China, and others buying Russian oil. Remember that there was a suspension of the secondary sanction from last year so that Russian oil afloat could be purchased. Besant refused to agree. Dmitriev went home. That was on a Wednesday. On a Friday, the Treasury announced, U.S. Treasury announced, an extension of that waiver, but not because Dmitriev negotiated it. On Dmitriev's scorecard, there are a bunch of zeros. He's achieved nothing, no project, no deal, no money. That's to say, no money on the top of the table. How much bribery is being paid under the table remains to be seen. But one of the other aspects, which I've investigated today in print, is that the Trump administration, the very people Dmitriev negotiates with, are very busy betting on the Iran war and on particular events in this war. They bet big money.
May I just park that for a second? I want to ask you about that, John. I want to go back to this, the notion of Putin endorsing Dmitriev's ongoing negotiations with, I won't hesitate in saying it, the shysters, Kushner and Witkov. And I think you and I have kind of had a bit of a debate around this in the past, and I'd like to, again, put forward an alternative interpretation of what's going on here. And let me just say at the very beginning, I'm not one of these people, these commentators in the alternative media who thinks that there's never any grounds for criticizing Russian President Vladimir Putin. I've criticized things that he has done and not done, and I'm perfectly willing to do it again. And I also want to reiterate, as I have on prior programs, including my discussions with you, that I have nothing but loathing and contempt for Kirill Dmitriev. I see him as a kind of diplomatic sycophant. His job is to basically ingratiate himself in every imaginable way with Donald Trump, never criticize anything that Trump does, flatter him to the maximum possible degree, always point the finger at the Europeans, who are effectively vassals of Washington. And you know, I've seen his public commentary on X, and I myself have often commented on it, replying to some of his tweets in a derisive manner. So again, I have no regard whatsoever for Kirill Dmitriev or these discussions. So with that as background, I think the key issue for me in trying to understand what's going on here and why, yes, I agree, Vladimir Putin in that statement endorsed the discussions, but why did he do that? What does he think is going to emerge from those discussions? You know, many times in my career as a class actions lawyer, when we were engaged in settlement negotiations and complex high-stakes matters with very capable opponents, we had this phrase called, and it's not like, you know, peculiar to class actions litigation, people who do negotiation for a living, they understand this concept perfectly well, and just the concept of keeping the conversation going. You do that even when you may be so far apart that there's no reasonable prospect of you coming to an agreement in the near term or maybe even in the medium term. But in the long run, you know that by keeping the conversation going, you are facilitating an ultimate resolution that may be acceptable to you.
Yes.
And when you're talking about two nuclear-powered states, it's extremely important to keep the conversation going, just if for no other reason than to avoid a nuclear war. Now, to me, the critical thing here is that I can't believe that Vladimir Putin, the president, doesn't understand that Witkov and Kushner are shysters, that they are completely unreliable, that they are ignoramuses, that they are corrupt. I can't believe he doesn't understand that. And to me, the critical point is, after all this time of discussion with the Trump regime, they're no closer to a resolution of the Ukraine war than they were when Trump re-entered the White House. And one could easily argue that they're further away because, for example, you're seeing attacks deeper and deeper into the Russian Federation. I think a recent one was 2,000 kilometers from the border with Ukraine. Hard to see. And I'm sure that the Russian government understands this better than I do, how they could carry out these attacks without the assistance of the United States military, at least providing targeting data and so forth. So I think one interpretation, you may well be right in your interpretation, although it's not entirely clear to me why you think Vladimir Putin continues to endorse these discussions, but one interpretation which I favor is that he's just keeping the conversation going and having to do so in ways that are exceptional. And namely, he's dealing with a president who is an extraordinary egomaniac, extremely narcissistic, extremely unpredictable. And for right or wrong, Vladimir Putin has decided that the best man for that unseemly job is Kirill Dmitriev. And that's really his job. Just keep the conversation going, because after all, absolutely nothing, as you and I agree, of any benefit to Russia has emerged from all of these talks. So why would Vladimir Putin endorse them when it's so clear, at least for the time being, that this isn't going to yield any kind of a resolution of the Ukraine war that is going to be acceptable to the Russian Federation? So that's my take on this. I'm curious in your response, John.
Well, I think we can both agree that we're saying that we agree on the multiple motivations. I don't think I'm using pejorative terms about those individuals on neither the Russian side nor the US side. I don't think I'm trying to express my opinion. I'm trying to present the evidence as widely as I can from all the sources that I can, interpreting what is on the paper, to be sure it's a readout paper, from what my sources tell me to how to interpret what's happening behind the scenes. Let's take it point by point. One, the war, the Ukrainian capacity to wage war and escalate is increasing. It's not decreasing. The military campaign to destroy the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, its capacity to build drones, launch drones, target missiles and drones, that campaign to destroy that capacity is failing because the drone attacks are increasing, as you said, in range and in intensity and in numbers and in lethality. They're killing more and more Russian citizens. So there has also been a number of territorial reversals. I'm not expressing lack of confidence in the Russian military right now. I am expressing lack of confidence in the wishful thinking that one sometimes hears on US podcasts from US podcasters who've been predicting a Russian total victory next week, in the next season, by the end of the summer, by the end of the fall, and so forth and so on. This is not happening. Further, what we have happening is increasing confidence on the part of the Zelensky regime, having survived a bunch of corruption cases, increasing confidence, not only buttressed by Chancellor Merz, Prime Minister Starmer, President Macron, and Prime Minister Maloney, but based on confidence in the, let's call it the US deep state, that, as you said, Dimitri, the US capabilities, the NATO capabilities to keep Ukraine fighting and fighting effectively, blunting Russian operations on the ground, in some places reversing them, and in some places inflicting casualties. All of that confidence is not retreating, it's growing. Right? Now, if that's your tactical and your operational situation, if that's your strategic, if I've described the strategic picture very broadly, broad brush, then you've got to say to yourself, what is the value in the Russian interest, both on the Ukraine battlefield and on the Iranian battlefield, in this view that Trump and his family represent an opportunity. That was the Russian consensus during the election campaign of 2024. It was the Russian consensus and popular view after Trump was elected. The view was then, and it was as he became president, that he represented an opportunity to negotiate an end to war on terms that Russia could accept, that was impossible, terms that were impossible during the Biden administration. I think we can both agree that Trump has proved to be no better in delivering that promise than the Biden administration was in delivering an absence of promise. So then the question becomes, strategically, if we agree, both of us, I don't disagree that keeping conversation going is essential. However, one of the principles, one of the elements of conversation between states is conversations at the foreign ministry level, at the diplomatic level, at the embassy level. And the person in charge of that on the Russian side has been Foreign Minister Lavrov. The person on the U.S. side has been Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Every attempt was made by Russia on the U.S. promise to build improvement of communications, facilitation, people-to-people exchanges, relationships in conferencing on all issues, whether it was strategic arms or agricultural export issues or what have you. Every one of those initiatives has been blocked by the United States. Rubio has overseen a program of total blackout of conversation. It's not the case that the U.S. wants to continue conversations. In fact, it's held all of that hostage to Russian concessions on the Ukrainian battlefield. It's gone nowhere because that's the U.S. policy. So you raised the question. It's a good question, a fair question. What's the purpose of Dmitriev? I do not think his purpose is to keep a conversation going. It's to bribe the Trump family. It's to participate in one of the largest schemes of corruption ever run out of the United States presidency. It involves Trump, his two sons, Eric and Donald Jr., both of them potential candidates to succeed Trump in the next election, the presidential election. And they will, in my view, be more likely to be chosen as Trump's successor than Vance or Rubio, depending on what happens in the midterm elections. But leaving that aside, and leaving aside the possibility that it's a good idea for Russia to use an individual like Dmitriev to have quiet conversations with the Trump succession, no doubt it's a good idea. But does Russia as a state, does Russian military interests on the two battlefields, does Russia strategically on any issue you can name gain from anything Dmitriev represents? First, as a personal, let's say, emissary between Dmitriev and Witkoff and Kushner. Let's call that the keeping the conversation going question. What's its purpose? Second, do you sacrifice in continuing the conversations on this level, as the readout put it, a happy birthday Melania level? Do you sacrifice your capability to deter the United States from what President Putin purportedly told Trump would be a very bad idea, attacking Khark Island, for example, or Keshem Island, or using the Marines that are being increasingly deployed and the airborne troops to actually occupy a part of Iran, as that Isfahan operation a couple of weeks back was attempting to test? Do you sacrifice deterrent strength? Is that what happens when you employ Dmitriev to do these things? That's a question. It's not a rhetorical question. Second, do you convince your allies, Iran, China, and North Korea, leaving aside Cuba for the moment, do you convince your allies that you're unreliable, that you're preparing and willing and contemplating at the presidential level to cut a deal that would leave an American knife in their backs? That's a second question. It's not a rhetorical one. So I agree with you, Dimitri, that there is a purpose in maintaining, especially if you're superpowers, but any government should be doing this. Big ones, little ones, no doubt. There's a purpose served in maintaining conversations, yes, but the purpose has to be subordinated to your tactical objectives, your operational ones, and your strategic ones. In the bilateral relationship, I've just said, but equally in the multilateral relationships that Russia aims to have with Iran, Mr. Arakchi, on the Monday, the Chinese and the North Koreans. The North Koreans we've had a Russian defense minister visit to North Korea in the last few days. Does Russia, does Putin's behavior, does Dmitriev's behavior undercut tactical, operational, and strategic priorities? That's a question.
So let me just say, I'm sure I would be astonished if this weren't true, that the Russian government thinks that Donald Trump is corrupt, and maybe you can bribe the man into doing a deal that is in Russian interests.
If they think that they're wrong. No, wait a minute.
If I may, I think they are wrong, but it wouldn't surprise me at all, given the behavior of Donald Trump, if they formed that view. Okay, he obviously is somebody who is corrupt. He's self-dealing constantly in some of the most outrageous ways. He's barely even pretending, to be separating his personal interests from the business of government. So one can easily understand that a government would form that view, but I think they're wrong. And this is the point I want to just stress here. After all of these talks, what has this yielded for Russia? Absolutely nothing. And so I just wanted to, express that view, but I don't want to stop you from explaining some more about this most outrageous of bribery schemes, or maybe not bribery might not be the right word, but corruption schemes you talk about in an article, namely the polymarket wagering on behalf of the Trump clan. Could you elaborate on all of that?
Well, let me come back to one important point you made. President Putin has direct experience of bribing American presidential candidates. And I told the story when it was happening. I reported it in one of the books. The Russian side bribed the Clinton family back in 2007, 2008, when General Motors was bankrupt and the United States government was preparing to spin off and sell up bits and pieces of the GM system. The GM assets that were of special interest to Germany and Russia were the Opel company, the Opel car company. And at that time, through Oleg Deripaska, bribes were paid to the Clinton family to secure Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, approval of a German-Russian plan to acquire Opel and merge it with a Russian car company that Oleg Deripaska ran. It was backed by Chancellor Merkel, the German car unions. It was backed for financing from the Sberbank, the Russian state bank. Clinton took the bribe and then reneged on the deal. And Putin was personally furious, obviously politically furious. The Russian side has been through this with America at that level. So the conviction that the Trump family can be bribed is notwithstanding all of the experience that the Russian side has built up over the years of the inadequacy of bribing senior Americans because they take the bribe and then don't honor their part of the deal. What you've asked me about, let's call it the Polymarket affair, is something that isn't yet surfaced in Russia as strongly as it should. Polymarket is a platform for using cryptocurrency to bet on events, sports events, the weather, but in particular, billions of dollars are now being wagered through Polymarket on political and military events. Polymarket's the creation of somebody called Shane Coplan. He's from an Upper West Side family in Manhattan. And he's closely connected by money to Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, and David Sachs and various other investors around the Witkoff family, the Lutnick family, and the Kushner family. What is now clear, there's a report which I'm just looking to the side, won't bother holding it up, because you can get the links in today's Dances with Bears. The Anti-Corruption Data Collective, I'm reading from the cover, has just produced a report called Insider Risks in Polymarket, that's the brand name, Political Markets. And it shows how insider trading has placed and won bets on military action. It includes a special study of betting on the U.S. bombing attack on the Iranian nuclear installations of last June 2025. Okay, they're establishing that insiders wagered money. Now, there are two forms of bet on Polymarket closely connected to the Trump family. One is the wagering on a military event, an attack on. This particular study looked at the Iran war back last June. It hasn't looked at the February 28 betting, but others in the United States have uncovered plenty of evidence that $2 billion worth of wagers were suddenly rushed through the market, through platforms like this, to bet on the date of and time of the attack on Iran. Okay, that's what's going on. It's $1 billion betting business. But more than that is a multi-billion-dollar business if you float shares in Polymarket on a New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, and you turn what was valued 2 or 3 years ago, Junior Kaplan, he's in his 20s, his business at somehow $300 million, based on a revenue estimate, a profitability estimate of the wagering. That was 2 or 3 years ago. He's currently refinancing with private money a target valuation of $15 billion. $15 billion. So if you're a Trump family member, pardon me, or a Witkoff family member, or a Kushner family company, or any of the larger investment houses in which they're influential, you are betting on multi-billion-dollar return by buying a cheap stake now in Polymarket and selling it into the market when it hits 15 billion. Now, what does that add up to? It adds up to a Trump calculation. They can start wars, they lose, but they will make big profits in money. Fighting wars, launching attacks, and making profits are a combination that, in my view, the audience may correct me, has never, ever been attempted at the level of the United States presidency before. It's the most grotesque form of corruption I've ever encountered, ever. Okay, now, we know that this is beginning to surface on the Democratic side in the anti-Trump press, We know that a soldier managed to make some $400,000 profit on the wagering that the attack on Maduro would occur when it did. And he's been arrested and he'll be booked and he'll be thrown in prison. But he's a minnow, in this operation that's whale size and great white shark size. But more important than that, it's typical. Oh, by the way, there's a Russian investor in this too, but he's not resident of Moscow. This is typical of what the Russian side, not all of us, happen to think is an opportunity to persuade the Trump family to come to terms on issues that are of strategic value to the Russian state. Only they don't mean it's the Russian state. They mean it for themselves. So, to go back and try to wrap this up, Dimitri represents the kind of Russian counterparty to the poly-market mentality that prevails in the White House. And he sees that as an opportunity. And so do the Russian oligarchs see that as an opportunity to enrich themselves with Trump. And they think he's persuadable. Why? Because that's how their money flows. And you can see it in the way poly-market is developing. So I'm drawing attention to one element of the crypto empire that others are documenting more effectively, more comprehensively in association with the Trump family than I can or have. But I raise it as a matter of, to answer your point, Dimitri, it's a good point. What's the value that the Russian side sees, in particular President Putin and Kirill Dmitriev, in persisting with this kind of operation on the other side? And does it damage Russian credibility, their credibility with Iran, with China, with North Korea, and also, as you said rightly, the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris?
Well, John, you're more diplomatic than I, but it sounds to me like you have as dim a view of Dmitriev as I do. You just choose your words more carefully.
Wait a minute. I think it's a very important point. So let's hear from our audience. I think resistance journalism, in that phrase, that noun, that collective noun, that's journalism is an investigation to resist the lies. Politics are different. And for the time being, off air, you and I can say quite a lot, but I think on air in resistance journalism, and this is the new journalism, I hope it's fun for everybody. Podcasting isn't like the old days where I could lie in bed and read the New York Times all the way through on a Sunday morning. It's not magazine journalism. Never mind what we think of the New York Times now, or even then. We don't read it lying down on Sunday morning. We get up straight and we listen. Okay, that's the way it is now. But I understand that what you're doing, Dimitri, as resistance journalism is a new mode of investigation of the truth. And we're here to resist the lies. That's
well said. Well said, my friend. As always, John, been a great pleasure speaking with you. I was going to touch on this little nonsense between Israel and Ukraine involving allegedly stolen grain, but that's a minor matter compared to the weighty issues we've been discussing, and we're now almost an hour into our discussion. So we'll maybe reserve that for a subsequent interview, and thank you very much. And again, I want to wish you and our audience a happy and prosperous Mayday.
Thanks, Dimitri. Me too.